So my parents gave me this book to read a while back. It's this fictional book of an account of a New England church where a lot of change has happened and where some of the older folk are starting to feel displaced while the church begins to bring in new things and to try and attract a different and younger demographic. So in this book, everything comes to a head at a congregational meeting over changes that the church management had proposed to the congregation. Namely, they wanted to spend $150,000 to upgrade the technology in the sanctuary with a new sound system, theater-style lighting, 2 new projectors and screens to enhance the quality of the videos and PowerPoints used during the service. And I just want to add that our $30,000 seems a paltry sum in comparison to what they were looking for. $150,000, can you imagine? I don't know what they do. Anyway, the leadership had thought that this would be a slam dunk, that everyone would be on board. But many of the older members were resistant to spending money on these things. And eventually the meeting devolved into the members speaking their frustrations at all the changes that were occurring, and a division between the younger leadership and the older stalwarts of the congregation became clear. And so in an attempt to understand where they were coming from, the minister decides that he's going to meet with those who are opposed to the changes on Tuesday evenings to try and work through what is really going on. And those who were attended were told, you can be completely honest here, and one by one, they begin to share their frustrations. And they say things like, we miss the old hymns that we sang when we were young. Couldn't we have just one old hymn every Sunday? And they thought there was too much use of technology and images, and they missed the sermons of old that dealt with doctrine and theology. This church had replaced the choir with worship bands, and these folk really missed the choir leading singing on Sunday mornings. And then they started complaining about how younger people didn't give enough in the offering plate and that they weren't as committed financially as the older set. And eventually one woman summed up the feelings with this statement: all I know is that someone stole my church, and I want to get it back. And I must admit, I kind of chuckled as I was reading this book, because I imagine many of these conversations have happened or are happening here at Macdougall. And some of them reach us at the Worship and Music Committee, and we discuss things and we make adjustments. And other times I hear about these conversations almost accidentally, like they say this or that. And to be honest, I'm never really quite sure who they are. And most of these conversations really don't happen around me, and for that I'm grateful in some ways, but concerned in others. My impression of this church as we transition some of our worship and other programs is that we are a warm and loving community, that we are welcoming and caring, and we are understanding that the need to change some things to reach a younger and more diverse demographic is necessary, but still many are wistful of the days gone by when things were more comfortable for many of us. The interesting thing is my parents go to Center Street Church, and they've been there as charter members when it was 15 families. And so my mother has experienced the very same things you're experiencing here. And when she gave me that book, she was chuckling all the way through because it resonated so much with her. And so we know that we're not alone in this, because all across the country and the continent, churches are grappling with change and wondering how to stay afloat, how to attract new people, but also to keep the faithful people in their pews who are the biggest givers and who have dedicated themselves to this community. How do we bring that balance? For me, when I consider the future of this church, it's important to go back to the basics. And that's why I love the reading, just like Melanie said. I love the reading from today because the text says that the community continually committed themselves to learning what the apostles taught them, to gathering for fellowship, to breaking bread, and to praying. And there was this intense sense of togetherness, and they shared what they had with each other. They used their money that they got from selling some of their goods to help people in need, and they worshiped together, and they shared meals, and they praised God. And as a result, the text says they enjoyed the goodwill of all the people of the city. And that God added to their numbers day after day as a result of this. If we look at what this early Christian community looked like, we kind of find the prototype for the Christian church, or what the Christian church should be throughout its history. There's fellowship and worship, praying, learning, breaking bread, and a sense of community and helping the needy and each other through hard times. And if a church is about this at its core, it is a vibrant church that enjoys the goodwill of all the people of the city. In other words, the church and its members are admired in the community, and they are recognized for all that they do. To me, it's interesting how the text ends, this idea that God added to their numbers. Because it's clear that by the 4th century, Christianity was practiced widely across the Roman Empire, which is one of the reasons why Constantine felt that the time had come to overturn paganism and embrace this Christianity as the main religion of the empire. But I ask myself, and many scholars have as well, how did they go from this little backwater religion of a few thousand people in Jerusalem to this great Christian church that was throughout the empire? Rodney Stark traces this in his book called The Rise of Christianity, and he notes that contrary really to how the book of Acts explains these mass conversions, they said, they went out and they preached in the square and all these people became Christians. That's the story in Acts, and as you write about a movement, often you mythologize what has happened, and we have some of that in the book of Acts. No doubt there was preaching and conversion, but not to the extent probably that they say in the book of Acts. Stark says that Christianity spread through contact between followers and their friends and family. And it's the same in any new religion that is taking hold. You gain converts from the people you know. But in order for a religion to expand beyond this small gathering of friends and family and the people you know, it has to remain open to new people and new ideas. And so the difference between Christianity and many of the other mystery religions, as they were called of the time, is that their faith was practiced in public, and they were intentional about welcoming new people. Because when you practice your religion in secret, your shelf life is pretty short. But there were other reasons that Christianity took hold in the Roman world, according to Stark. It helped that, unlike paganism, Christianity demanded this exclusive commitment. You're a Christian, you don't worship other gods. And a Christian convert, someone who became a Christian, had every area of their life absorbed into the community. Their social life, their educational life, and their spiritual life, and everything else became part of the Christian community. They also stood against abortion and infanticide, which were common at that time and had a disproportionate effect on women, who were actually the majority of the Christian converts. And then, unlike pagan leadership, they stayed in the cities when the plagues came, and they cared for the sick, and that resulted in a lower rate of mortality amongst the Christian community. And you can imagine the other people go, I'm joining them because they don't die when the plague comes. And this was all in contrast to paganism of the time that had really run its course, that had in many ways lost the ability to meet the spiritual needs of the population. And so Christianity focused on collective action, things that they did together, and it drew its resources from all of the adherents, whether they were rich or poor, instead of this wealthy elite that supported paganism. And it was the commitment of its members and this sense of community that gave early Christianity its strength. And so in many ways, the rise of Christianity was like the rise of any other religion that takes hold. It proceeds at exactly the same pace as other religions that appear to be growing. And so you can rightfully ask, whether it had anything to do with the beliefs at all. In fact, when I used this book in a class on early Christianity, many in the class were very upset at this book because they wanted to believe, that the Spirit came and people were converted en masse, and it was just this huge movement, and nothing had ever been seen like this before. But Stark argues that even though it proceeded in much the same way, it was these particular doctrines and beliefs in Christianity that were the ultimate factor for why it rose in prominence. And these are the things that really made the difference. First of all, the idea that God so loved the world was a radical departure from the pagan understanding of the gods, who were almost entirely indifferent to the plight of human existence. The classical philosophers of the time regarded pity and mercy as pathological emotions, and they were defects of your character if you gave in to them. But Christianity argued that mercy was a primary virtue, that God is merciful, and God requires us to be merciful as well. And then this idea that arises out of God so loved the world is that we must love one another. And this is the way that we please God. And this also is a new idea and a departure from the time. And then this idea of loving one another was extended to include everyone, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And this meant that Christianity transcended borders and races and created communities that were diverse and rich. This was vitally important for the Roman Empire because they were vast and they had embraced so many different ideas and areas and languages and races, and they had no cohesive structure. And so Stark says Christianity served as a revitalization movement within the empire by offering this coherent culture that was entirely stripped of ethnicity. And then further, Christianity offered these liberated relationships between the sexes and inside the family, where in that time the patron was everything, the father, right? The patron. It alleviated class differences because the slave and the noble one greeted each other with the peace of Christ. That's why we do it every Sunday. For those of you who don't like the peace of Christ, that's one of them they say things. We pass the peace of Christ because that was the sign of class being squashed, that all of us pass the peace of Christ, regardless of your station in life. For Stark, though, the biggest contribution of Christianity was its new conception of humanity in a world that was, he says, saturated with capricious cruelty and a vicarious love of death. This was seen in the spectacles of the Colosseum. I was just there last month at the Colosseum, and they explained to us, how gladiators were trained to fight to the death and how criminals were thrown to wild animals. They had like a jungle there of wild animals and eaten to death in front of people as they watched. It was a huge Colosseum. It wasn't no 30 people, around a Netflix movie. It was a true spectacle. And Christians were abhorred by this, not just because some of them had been part of this, but because of this idea that life did not matter. And they provided a moral vision that was utterly incompatible with the casual cruelty of pagan custom. And so ultimately, it was the character of Christianity that triumphed in its time, a character that was formed out of basic beliefs that gave life to the community. So we go back to this book, which is called Who Stole My Church? And in this book, the minister points out the basic issues with the frustrations that had been raised, and they were legitimate and certainly not to be dismissed. But they had begun to see the church as their church instead of God's church. And I think sometimes we might be like that too. because we think the church is there to take care of me, a place to meet my friends, to sing songs that I know and love, to pray in ways that are comfortable for me, to congregate with like-minded people who think like I do. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with an organization like that. Nothing wrong. There's lots of them. But if we're going to be God's church, we need to keep our eyes focused on the fundamentals of our faith. God so loved the world. And in response, we are called to love each other. And that love extends beyond our comfort zone. That love makes space for difference. That love enjoys the participation of people who are different and tolerates the music of those who are a bit younger. And that love shows mercy, and it gives help to the needy. That love cares for the sick, and it stands against cruelty and indifference. And that love provides opportunities to live and grow and allows us to meet as equals in this place and in our world, regardless of how much money we have or what our job is or where we live. And that love transforms heart. And that love transforms worlds. And so my prayer for Macdougall is that we remember that we are sitting in God's church. And just as the early Christians did, we commit ourselves to learning and to fellowship, to breaking bread and praying. And through this, we will become a community committed to welcoming all in the name of love, committed to transforming our world. And in that process, Macdougall will enjoy the goodwill of all the people of the city. Amen.